Got myself some wisdom from a leather-backed book. Got myself a savior when I took a second look. Opened up the pages, and what did I find? A black and white portrait of a king who's a friend of mine. Funny how when you think you're right, everybody else must be wrong, till someone with fool's wisdom somehow comes along. His voice was strange and the words he said I didn't quite understand, yet I knew that he was speaking right by the leatherback book in his hand. Hey, hey, what a day, fool's wisdom. Got myself some wisdom from a leather-backed book. Got myself a savior when I took a second look.
So we go back to the Bible. The first people who were there were Jews. Not yet called Jews. Let's say they're not even called this yet. Israelites. Later they were called Hebrews. They were there first. This goes on. And it goes on until approximately the 13th century. They're in Egypt for about 420 years. Then they come back. During that time, the Hebrews left. It was the Canaanites. But Joshua fought the battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. They went back to the Hebrews, the Ivrim. Then it goes on. This is approximately 13th century BC, or if you prefer, BCE. Well, what happens? And around 1250, the conquest is completed. And around the year 1000 BC, 1010 perhaps, King David establishes Jerusalem as the capital. And it goes on. But because of the sin of the people, a split happens among the Jews, just as happened among the sons of Ham. (720 BC), the Assyrian captivity of the 10 northern tribes. 585 BC, Judah also backslides and goes the way of Israel, the 10 northern tribes. And then you have the Babylonians. Okay. We will leave it there for a 10-minute break, and then we will continue. Mark this passage in your Bible. It is a necessary text and weapon, ammunition in the present Kulturkampf and the present Geisterkampf, spiritual war, culture war. Isaiah 11. Verse 11. It'll happen on that day that the Lord will again recover his second time with his hand the remnant of his people who will remain. From Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamat, the islands of the sea. Notice it is a diverse array of nations for the second time. Twice and only twice were the Jews to be split up and regathered. The first time happened as predicted by Jeremiah and Isaiah and referred to in Daniel. This happened at approximately 520 BC with the decree of Cyrus the Great, followed by Darius the Mede. Okay. That was the first time. But then they only came back from the Persian Empire, which encompassed Iran and the former lands of Babylon and Assyria, say Iraq, part of Syria. If we read Ezra, Nehemiah, and 2nd Chronicles, and Ezra wrote 2nd Chronicles, you see that the people of the 10 northern tribes who went into the Assyrian captivity after the Persians conquered Assyria, as Isaiah also predicted would happen in Isaiah chapter 44 and 45. The Jews from the 10 northern tribes came back with them, so they were never lost. Additionally, during the national backsliding of the kings like Jeroboam II, during the reign of kings like Asa, a good king, in Judah, the faithful people from the 10 northern tribes came south and joined Judah, part of the tribe of Dan, but a lot of other people. That is why in the New Testament you read when James writes his epistle to the 12 tribes, they weren't lost. Or when you read Luke's nativity narrative, remember the old lady, Hannah? She was from the tribe of Asher. These tribes were never lost. The scripture tells us exactly what happened to them, and so does history. This old nonsense of British Israelism and the lost tribes, these things are absolute nonsense. They have no biblical, historical, or anthropological basis whatsoever. It's all nonsense. Separate subject, I only mention it in passing. So the first time was 520 BC. They come back. Hebrews. The second time, however, they'd be regathered again. And it would be from a vast array of nations. The Jews are only regathered to the land twice. The first time was after the Babylonian and Assyrian captivities. The second time it's happened is 20th century. That's the prediction. It only happened twice. But let's continue. This goes on until .63. The Hellenistic period, the Yevanim in Hebrew, we know as the Greeks. This goes on until (160 BC). As predicted by Daniel, as celebrated by Jesus in John 10, Hanukkah, the Maccabee revolt. Going into the Hasmonean period, Hebrews. What happens then? This goes on until an event happens that prefigures what the Antichrist is going to do. They made a deal with the Romans. The Roman general Pompey enters the Holy of Holies, a type of the Antichrist. Whenever somebody other than the high priest enters the Holy of Holies, it's a picture of the Antichrist setting up the abomination. This was the general Pompey. They made a deal with the Romans, and they were betrayed by the Romans. Daniel says this will happen again. They'll make a covenant with death. They'll make a deal with the Antichrist and be betrayed by him. They thought they were going to be a protectorate, that the Romans were going to protect them. The Romans did not protect them. The Romans basically annexed them. 63. This goes on until the revolt. Again, predicted by Daniel and Jesus. Shortly following the martyrdom under Nero of Peter and Paul, the revolt takes place 60 to 70 AD now. Goes back. Josephus writes about it in Wars of the Jews. To the Hebrews, that ends. '70 AD, temples destroyed as Daniel and Jesus predict. And it's back again under the Romans. Until the 2nd century. Something that Jesus also prophetically alluded to in John chapter 5, Bar Kokhba's rebellion. The second Jewish revolt, approximately 120 AD. Goes back to the Hebrews. They follow a false Messiah named Bar Kokhba, having rejected the true one named Jesus. And as the false prophet will tell Jews to follow the Antichrist, Rabbi Akiva, a false prophet told the Jews to follow Bar Kokhba. These are addressed in my book, Shadows of the Beast. But it goes on. By the year 132, it's all over. Even before that, but it goes back to the Romans. And the Jews are now not even allowed in Jerusalem. The Emperor Hadrian would rename the city Arelina Capitolina and build a temple to Jupiter on the Temple Mount. Big story in itself. But then what happens? This goes on into the Roman Empire, eventually fragments. Then it is the Byzantines. Constantine's mother, Helen, comes and, well, that's where this happened, that's where that happened. I don't know. Goes on. Well, what was next? Arabians. It's at this time the Dome of the Rock, the Mosque of Omar, is initially built. Now, it's not our subject now, but all of these things on the Temple Mount foreshadow the abomination of desolations spoken of by Daniel and Jesus. In 70, the Romans set up pagan incense where the holies of holies have been, began worshiping of the gods. Okay. Arelina Capitolina, Temple of Jupiter, picture of the abomination of desolations. Jupiter was what the Greeks called Zeus, was the biggest planet, that was the big god. Zeus was a corruption of the Greek word theos, God. Zeus, theos. Okay. Constantine's nephew, Julian the Apostate tries to repaganize the Roman Empire and rebuild the temple. All these mysterious fires happen. And one stone will be thrown down upon another. That prophecy had to take place, and he tried to make it not take place. The Muslims get there. Dome of the Rock. If you've ever seen it, you will see naturally occurring, naturally embossed in the facade, marble facade, two absolutely satanic-looking figures. And above it, quotation from the Surah in the Quran, Allah is not begotten, neither does he beget, God has no son. What are we told in 1 John? That which denies the Father and Son is Antichrist. Now, is it the abomination of desolation? No, but it is an abomination of desolation. This is in the Arabian period. And it goes on. The way that the economy of Europe is reliant upon oil from the Middle East than it was a pre-industrial agricultural economy. And spices were a way in an agricultural economy not only to make food taste better, but to last longer. Spices revolutionized the economy of Europe. The troubadours' crusades went all the way to India. The spice trade routes went through the Holy Land. The war was ostensibly about the right of Christian pilgrims. Well, that was a half-truth. It was about the spice trade. Today, it's about oil. Then it was about spices. And the rival banking families of Italy wanting to control the papacy and the economy of Europe and so forth. This is the period of the unholy crusades. But they, of course, said they were holy. Not long after William the Conqueror conquered England. They called it the Holy Latin Kingdom. And they basically made it like European feudalism with lords, nobles, the whole bit. These are the days of Richard the Lion-Hearted and so forth. This goes on. Finally, Salah ad-Din at the Horns of Hattin defeats the Crusades. The last holdout is the city of Akko, known as Ptolemy in the New Testament. Paul stopped there, but now it's Akko. And they finally withdraw to Europe, taking as much pillage as they can with them after their defeat by Salah ad-Din. Now then, Islam was having its golden age. Europe was in the Dark Ages. Islam, however, was a westernized philosophical Islam. It was not an Islamic fundamentalist Islam. They followed the philosophies of Aristotle. And while under medieval Roman Catholicism, Western Europe, Germany, England, France, Italy, Spain, were in the Dark Ages. If you want to know what a Roman Catholic world would look like, look at what a Roman Catholic world was like. Look at the Dark Ages. They had carte blanche to do anything they wanted for 1,200 years. Look what they did. They put Europe into the Dark Ages. It wasn't until the Renaissance it began to climb out of it. The Byzantine Empire preserved Greco-Roman civilization in the East, but the Crusades conquered that. When the Crusades came back from the East, they saw Islamic architecture, flying buttresses. Islam was ahead in astronomy, mathematics, chemistry, medicine. and the seeds of the Renaissance were planted in Europe. Then it was the Roman Catholic world who were the pagan barbarians. The same as you see Islamic suicide bombers sending children, the suicide bombers. Then that was the Catholic Church under Saint Bernard. No wonder they named the dog after him. The Children's Crusades. Literally. You get out of purgatory free. Get out of purgatory free. And the kids were dying. Islam was relatively civilized. Roman Catholicism was barbarian. They were the pagans. They were the savages. Okay. Of course, it was a different Islam than you see now. This goes on. But after Salah ad-Din in 1291, a different kind of Muslim gets control. Mamelukes. Succeeded in 1516 by the Ottoman Turkish Muslims who enslaved the Arab Muslims. To understand what that hatred was like, read the book Lawrence of Arabia. This took place 1516. The Australians were so angry about what happened in the Dardanelles at Gallipoli. They were hell-bent on vengeance. And the British, under General Allenby, marched on Jerusalem, taking their vengeance for Gallipoli in a massive cavalry charge at Beersheba, where Abraham was. The Australians broke the back of the Ottomans in the Middle East. Lawrence of Arabia engineered an uprising among Arabs against the Turks, who were aligned with the Kaiser in Germany. Okay. This goes on, 1917. Great Britain. In the aftermath of World War I, the map of Europe and the map of the Middle East had to be redrawn, and much of Africa. These countries you see in the Middle East today were not the original nations. The French created Lebanon and Syria. Lebanon was to be dominated by Arab Christians. Syria would be dominated by Muslims. But the Muslims have taken it over, pretty much. Or very much. Iraq, an artificial nation, forcing a fusion between Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds, invented by the British. Jordan, 30% Bedouin Arab, 70% so-called Palestinian Arab, but a Hashemite Bedouin monarchy. Hashemites being the tribal family of Mohammed from Saudi Arabia. It is a country that is mostly Palestinian Arab, for want of a better term, but it has a Hashemite Arabian government. That was what Black September was about. After World War I, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, these countries were invented by Europeans. And the Balfour Declaration said that land would go to the Jews. This was decided in San Remo, Italy, and it was decided by the predecessor of the United Nations, known as the League of Nations, on the legal principle still established in international law, uti proceditus juris. The borders remain what they were. So the original land apportioned to the Jews after World War I by the League of Nations, the predecessor of the UN, was all the land from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. By international law, the West Bank belongs to the Jews, you understand? But forget about that. Something happens. (1948). There they are again. Those pesky Ibrim, the Hebrews, just like God told Abraham. I'm giving this to you and your descendants through Isaac and Jacob. Olame olamim. If you like Latin, Romniase kulase kulorum. That's it. Forever and ever. Notice two things. Going back to the patriarchs, no matter who had it, it kept going back to the people God promised it to. Second thing, there has never been such a state or nation as Palestine. Palestine is simply the Latinization of Philistine. The Philistines were not Arabs. They were Indo-Europeans. They worshiped the fish god Dagon. The Romans in the 2nd century, after Bar Kokhba's rebellion, renamed the whole place Palestine. Before that, it was never called Palestine. Called Israel, Judea, so on. Canaan, but never Palestine. A Palestinian was somebody who lived somewhere between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. The original name of the Jerusalem Post, a newspaper I occasionally would write for many years ago, was originally called the Palestine Post. The original name of the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra was the Palestine Philharmonic Orchestra. During the Second World War, 30,000 Jews from the British Mandate fought under Montgomery against Mussolini and Hitler. 30,000 Jews on their patch, the British Palestine Legion. Every one of them was a Jew. Palestinian was anybody. Jew, Arab, Christian, Druze. As long as you lived there, it was a geographical designation. It was never an ethnic one. The Arabs who lived there were the Arabs like in any other Arab country. Well, there's a third factor. Factor one, it always reverted to the people God gave it to. Factor two, there was never a Palestinian state. Factor three, although many people occupied it, only twice was there an expulsion of the Jews. And only twice, as Isaiah predicted, would they be regathered. You understand? It happened in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah in 520, and it happened in 1948. Although the Aliyah began in the late 19th century. Just as Isaiah predicted. That is the irrefutable historical record. Not just a biblical record, it's a historical record. Archaeology does not lie. Politicians lie. Theocrats lie. The mainstream media lies. Archaeology doesn't lie. The archaeological record verifies the Jews are the indigenous people. And so I ask, can a Seminole occupy Florida? Of course not. Why not? They were there first. Don't you want to watch them wrestle alligators? Buy some souvenirs in the Everglades? They were there first. Let them have their casinos. What's your problem? Of course, they're not an occupying presence. Well, can an Apache occupy Arizona? Of course not. Let them have their casinos. What's wrong with you? Well, can a Maori occupy New Zealand? Of course not. Why not? They were there first. Can an Irishman occupy County Tipperary? Certainly not. Why not? It was there first. By definition, an indigenous people cannot be considered to be an occupying presence in their native land. Unless they are a Jew. Sociologically, Israel is rather interesting. In Israel, Jews get the identities denied them in the diaspora. In France, le Juif, he's a Jew, get out of here. In Deutschland, Juden verboten, du bist eine Juden. Get out of here. Argentina, Judío. Get out of here. Romania, Jew, get him out of here. We don't want you here. They faced expulsion in England and France. They faced expulsion in Germany. They faced expulsion in Russia and the pogroms. They faced expulsion one country after another. Inquisitions in Spain, Portugal. Get them out of here. They tried to escape to Brazil from the Inquisition. They didn't like them there either because of the Catholic Church. So they came to New York. And then the Dutch Reformed Church, Peter Stuyvesant in New Amsterdam, didn't like them either. Get the Jews out of here. They were kicked out of New York. New Amsterdam, as it was. You're a Jew, get out. Where should we go? Go find your own land. Okay, we did. Get out of here. You have no business being in your own land either. You understand this? This is the curse of the law. This is the curse of Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28. It is because they rejected their Messiah. Now, God keeps his prophetic purposes and promises to the fathers, Paul tells us in Romans. They remain beloved for the sake of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they're under the curse of the law. They're hated by all nations. And they don't even want them in their own nation. They're called a colonial presence, as if Europe was their home country. Didn't you ever hear the Spanish Inquisition or the Holocaust or the pogroms? They didn't want them in. They were kicked out of England in 1200s. They murdered them in Yorkshire. Their native land was not Europe. Their native land was Israel. Only a Jew can be called a colonialist, a European settler in their own nation. No indigenous person could be considered to be an occupying presence unless they're a Jew. It's not rational. It's not fair. But that's what we're dealing with. The world is in the power of the wicked one. These are the realities. This is the truth. No matter who got the land, it always went back to the ones God gave it to. There's never been a Palestinian state. More about that in a second. And twice, and only twice, were they to be regathered, and they have been. Jordan grabbed the West Bank in the 1940s. The Arabs who lived in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Jericho, Nablus, were Jordanians. Until one day in 1970, when the Tooth Fairy showed up with the magic wand. They all went to sleep that night, and the Tooth Fairy with the magic wand came and waved the magic wand. They went to bed being told they were Jordanians, thinking they were Jordanians, and they woke up Palestinians. And the Tooth Fairy didn't even leave them a buck. That's what happened. That's exactly what happened. In 1968, King Hussein of Jordan said, Jordan is Palestine. I met King Hussein of Jordan, the father of the present King Abdullah, in Williamsburg, Virginia, when I was 15. He said, Jordan is Palestine. In 1970, around the time of Black September, Yasser Arafat said Palestine is Jordan. Right from the beginning. Remember, from May of 1948 until June of 1967, nearly 20 years. May of 1948 to June of 1967. Gaza, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, all of it was in the hands of Arab Muslims. Arab Muslims had the West Bank, they had East Jerusalem, they had Gaza, they had it all. If they wanted a second Palestinian state, in addition to the one that they said they already had in Jordan. In other words, if they wanted a third Palestinian Arab Muslim state, why didn't they make one when they had nearly 20 years to do it? Nobody would have stopped them. But once Israel's there, this is an outrage. It's an occupation. It's colonialism. What did the indigenous people? Look at the archaeology. Forget about that. We don't care about the facts. Olenskism, Goebbels, Jesuit education. It's reality. He had 20 years. 20 years! Who says that there's already a two-state solution? The Jordanian government, the British government, Yasser Arafat, and the Palestinian Authority known as Fatah. The League of Nations and the United Nations, they all said that there's a Palestinian state in Jordan. Now they want a third one. No, they can't have a third one because Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, controls the West Bank undemocratically. They haven't had an election in nearly 20 years because they're afraid Hamas would win. So there's no legitimate Arab, Muslim, Palestinian government in the West Bank. They're in violation of the Oslo agreements, which the Jews are expected to keep, even though they don't. They haven't had an election in nearly 20 years. And Hamas, that's essentially controlled by Iran, controls the Gaza Strip. So now you need what? No, we need a four-state solution. This is getting ridiculous. We don't want a four-state solution. We want a one-state solution. From the river to the sea. They want the extermination of the Jews from their land. That is what's happening. I want to tell you about the most stupid people in Florida. Now, my family are Israeli Jews. I assure you I'm not anti-Semitic. But I want to tell you about the most stupid people in Florida, since we happen to be in Florida. These are the biggest morons in the state of Florida. These are the stupidest people in the state of Florida. They are the Jews who vote Democrat. Why don't you just sew a yellow star on your T-shirt and pay your own train fare to Auschwitz? How can you be in a party with the squad, with anti-Semites? How can you be so stupid? People can be unbelievably stupid. Unbelievably stupid. In the days of the Maccabees, there was someone called Menelaus. There were Jews who collaborated with the Seleucid Greeks against their own people. Today, it's the same thing. Debbie Wasserman Schultz from Florida, Chuck Schumer from New York. They're enemies, not just of America, they're enemies of their own people. How can you be in a party with Tliab and Olmert and these? But they are. Self-interest. They'll sell America down the river to radical Islam, and they'll betray their own people, the Jews, and have no qualms about it. People like Adam Schiff, they have no scruples and no morals, and those who vote for them have no brains. Tell them I said so. And I'm not a Republican, by the way. I'm an independent. Well, how do we understand this or approach this issue as Christians? As Bible-believing Christians, what does Jesus himself, speaking in the first person, say about what's happening now? What does he say? You've heard what social media says. You've heard what the politicians say. You've heard what mainstream media says. You've heard what the United Nothing says. You've even heard what I said. What does Jesus say? Look with me, please, to the book of Zechariah, chapter 12, if you don't know. He's speaking here in the first person by the Holy Spirit. Pre-nativity. Verse 1 of Zechariah 12, the burden of the word of the Lord. Who is the word of the Lord? The Davar Adonai, the Logos, is Jesus, according to John 1. His burden concerning Israel. Thus declares the Lord, who stretches out the heavens, lays the foundations of the earth, and forms the spirit of man within him. I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to all the people all around. And when the siege is against Jerusalem, it'll be against Judah. It'll come about in that day, I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the people, and all who lift it will be critically injured. All the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. All the nations of the earth? How many UN resolutions are passed against China because of Tiananmen Square? None. 1.2 million people at least watched it on TV and internet, the massacre in Tiananmen Square. How many resolutions passed them? None. But they killed 8,000 of their own people. They crushed them with tank them. No. What about the human rights abuses that happen throughout the Muslim world? You know, the massacre of Christians in Indonesia and in Africa. It was the UN resolutions. None. But to those infernal Jews who stand up against radical Islam, more than 50% of all UN and UN Security Council resolutions are passed against Israel. More than 50%. All the nations. All the nations. Iran is the world's #1 sponsor of Islamic terror. The Biden administration is the #1 sponsor of Iran. They've unfrozen $300 billion in Iranian liquid assets. That's who's funding the Houthis. That's who's funding Hamas. That's who's funding. Why is this not seen as treason? It is. When Ronald Reagan was president, his administration was supplying weapons to Iran. Reagan. Why was he not impeached? America abstained from a resolution under Barack Obama saying that Jews had no right to the biblical sites, no claim, including the Wailing Wall. America abstained. Didn't veto it, just abstained. Barack Obama called the Prime Minister of Britain, called the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and persuaded them to vote against Israel, to say the Jews had no right to the Wailing Wall. This is the American, this is Reagan, this is Obama, this is Biden, take your pick. Trump was different. Make of him what you want. But anybody who tries to remove Jerusalem, they're going to hurt themselves grievously. Remember, the real issue is not the final status of Gaza or the West Bank or the Golan Heights. It's the final status of Jerusalem. It's where Satan got his biggest defeat, and it's where he will get his final defeat. The feet of Jesus will stand on the Mount of Olives, Har Zayim. You lift it, you're going to be hurt grievously. You tried to divide Jerusalem. So let's look. Verse 10. I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, on Yeshpok al Bet David, the spirit of grace and supplication. They will look upon me who they have pierced, crucified, and mourn for him as one mourns for an only son. It's Jesus speaking in the first person. They will look upon me. The reference is Revelation 1:7. The Jews will be exterminated if he doesn't return and save them. Zechariah tells us 2/3 of them are going to be wiped out. It'll be worse than the Holocaust. In the Holocaust of the 1930s and 40s, 2/3 of European Jewry and 1/3 of world Jewry were exterminated. Now it's going to be 2/3. Judgments have always happened in thirds. Remember, like Ezekiel, how the hair of your head will perish, you had to shave the hair. 1/3 of the hair was burned, asphyxiated. 1/3 of it was chopped up with a sword, and 1/3 scattered to the breeze. A few hairs he had to tie to the fringe of his garment. Now that refers to the tzitzit, to the tassels on the talit, the prayer shawl. There's one for every commandment of the Torah. In other words, those Jews who kept the law of God kept them. The rest either died by the sword, they were scattered into the diaspora, or they were burned or asphyxiated. It's always thirds. There's other examples of this. Holocaust was thirds. Well, Zechariah tells us it's going to be in thirds. It's going to be in thirds. This has to happen in Jerusalem. Look with me, please, to Luke 21:24. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive into all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled under the feet of the Gentiles, the ethnic nations, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Now that is ultimately bound up with the prophecies of Daniel concerning the Temple Mount and so forth. Strictly speaking, the times of the Gentiles are not yet fulfilled, but they're being fulfilled. The Jews will be scattered among the nations until, pletheron in Greek. Times of the Gentiles, ethnon, pletheron, ethnon. Same two words occur in Romans 11 in a different but related context. A time will come when Jerusalem will no longer be under the feet of non-Jews. And that will include the Temple Mount, ultimately. Relates to Revelation 11 and so forth. Look at Matthew 23, verse 37. Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Yerushalayim, Yerushalayim. Who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were unwilling. I wanted to protect you from these terrible things that have happened to you throughout your history. I wanted to protect you. Going back to Genesis 3, Satan was trying to wipe you out. I was trying to protect you. But you rejected me. Your house is left to you desolate. You will not see me again, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, until you say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. You like the Vulgate? Benedictum qui veni in nomine Dominum. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Jerusalem must say that to Jesus. Zechariah, Jesus, not what the apostles and the prophets said about him. There are a lot of other passages where apostles and prophets talk about the Jews coming back. I'm just talking about what Jesus said. I'm coming back not just to the land, but to Jerusalem. They'll be back not just in the land, but in their capital. This is the only way major passages of the Old Testament can make sense. Major prophetic passages in the Old Testament can only make sense by taking Jesus literally. It's the only way certain passages of the book of Revelation can make sense. And it jives exactly with what we read in Daniel, with what Paul writes in 2 Thessalonians. They'll be back in that land. They will be back in that city. But somebody has a lot to lose. His name is the devil, Satan. He knows that two things have to happen concerning the Jews before his kingdom has fallen down. One is that they must be regathered to their land and to their capital, and he must get them out of there. He will use politics, politicians, the United Nothing, Islam, anything he can, including left-wing Jews, to stop that from happening. The other is in Romans. The natural branches being grafted in again. Jews turning to Christ in significant numbers again before he returns. Remember, the first Christians were Jews, the last Christians will be Jews. Not our subject now, but it relates. Satan hates the fact that Jews are beginning to believe again. I think of my own children when they were little in Galilee. My children were born in Galilee. And it was strange. I had been to university, but I'd never been to seminary. And when I came to Britain to study theology, my children didn't know English all that well. They knew Hebrew and they knew Romanian from their grandparents and a bit of Yiddish and some English at that time. And my daughter was 4, my son was 2. And we came to Britain and we attended a Baptist church. And my little girl, now she's a grown-up lady with a child of her own. She's a corporate lawyer, but anyway, then it was different. And she would ask me, and she's still learning English now, right? Abba, why do we go to church on Sunday instead of to the Asifa Meshachit, the Messianic Fellowship on Shabbat? Who's Jesus? She knew about Yeshua. What's Christmas? She knew about Hanukkah. What's Easter? She knew about Pesach, Passover. All she knew is that she was Jewish and she was from Galilee, and Jesus was Jewish and he was from Galilee, and he was the Messiah. 4 years old. That's all she knew. She had no concept of Western Gentile Christianity as a little. She didn't know what it was. Well, she understood after a couple of years, she had the whole thing worked out, but it was she just didn't get it. She's a little kid. What am I going to tell her? And my son more so. He was only 2 when he got to Britain, but that was it. And I remember my wife's family were mostly killed in the Holocaust, most of them, but her parents both narrowly escaped as children, very narrowly. But most of the family were killed. And I remember my children, when they were younger, saying to their grandparents, Saba, Safta, grandmother, grandfather, abuela, abuelo, why don't you believe in our Messiah, Yeshua? It was the children and grandchildren of the Jews who went through the Holocaust who turned to Christ. This has to be the hand of God. There's no other way to explain it. I remember more than 25 years ago here in the United States, the American College of Rabbis issued a statement saying, more Jews are coming to faith in Jesus as the Jewish Messiah now than in the last 18 centuries. That was then. Now you got second and third generation believing Jews. I remember when I first went to Israel, there were about 200 Jewish believers in the whole country. Everybody knew everybody. There was only 200 of them. Everybody knew everybody. Didn't matter if they were in Eilat, Jerusalem, Galilee. Everybody knew everybody. There was only a handful in the whole country. I couldn't tell you how many now, but it is thousands and thousands. Since the 1970s, thousands and thousands in his own land, among his own people. Here in the United States, tens of thousands, easily. Now, it may only be a small percentage of the overall Jewish population, but it's a lot more than it's ever been since the 2nd century. And you see it in Argentina, you see it in Canada, you see it in Britain, Australia. Everywhere there's Jews, there's believing Jews. South Africa, certainly. I've met believing Jews in Zimbabwe. Not many, but they were there. It's happening. The devil's very upset. He was able to blind the Lord's own people to their own Messiah, and now the scales are falling off and Satan is not happy. And they're back in that land, waiting for the Messiah to come. They will be deceived by a false Messiah. But when the true one comes, they will look upon him where they have pierced and mourn as one mourns for an only son. We can explain the historical and political realities. We can explain them. But we can understand why and what it means from the Word of God. There are academic historians, fair-minded ones. There are scholars, Jew and non-Jew, who could explain this to you better than I can. They can go into much greater depth and detail. There are plenty of academics who can explain this as well or better than I can, no problem. They can know it, but they can't understand it. They've read a lot of books, but most of them have not really read this one. Or if they have, they haven't understood it. We know what's happening, but we also know why. We not only have the knowledge, by the grace of God, we have the understanding. That is what makes this time different. Thank you so much for listening.
Why should I feel discouraged? Why should the shadows come? Why should my heart feel lonely and long for heaven and home? When Jesus is my portion, a constant friend is He. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. And why should I feel discouraged? Why should the shadows come? Why should my heart feel lonely and long for heaven and home? When Jesus is my portion and my constant friend is He. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. I sing because I am happy, and I sing because I'm free. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. I sing because I'm happy, and I sing because I'm free. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know He watches me. I know He watches me.